My name is Martha Nelson. I am a member of the Board of Advisors for the Institute for Leadership Studies, and I am chair of the Department of Public Health and Health Sciences here at Dominican. And I am honored to welcome you to Dominican and to the 2014 Fall Lecture Series. We are privileged to hold this series in partnership with Book Passage, Marin and San Francisco's own independent bookstore. Yay. The lecture series is a program of Dominican's Institute for Leadership Studies, which is a center for leadership development offering education and training for students and professionals, helping them to become better leaders. The Institute and Book Passage hold this forum in order to engage students, the campus, and the community in socially relevant discussions and to highlight inspired acts of leadership across disciplines. So, in case someone you know is watching the Giants game instead, shame on them, this live performance will also be aired on Dominican's website at dominican.edu/leadership. It will be podcast on Dominican Penguin Radio, and it will be aired on Wednesdays at 8 p.m., Channel 30 Public TV. Let me tell you about our sponsors. Our lead sponsor for the Leadership Lecture Series is Private Ocean Personal Powerful Wealth Management, one of the oldest and largest private-held wealth management firms in Marin. Private Ocean has been named 7 times by Worth Magazine as one of the top 100 registered investment advisors nationwide, and in 2013 was named as the best wealth management firm by North Bay Biz. As a testament to their commitment to community engagement, this is Private Ocean's 4th year as the Leadership Lecture Series lead sponsor. Thank you, Private Ocean Wealth Management, for continuing to help bring our community together. And tonight, our bronze sponsor is Hospice by the Bay. And I am happy that the new CEO of Hospice, Kitty Whitaker, is here tonight. Kitty Whitaker has worked with Hospice by the Bay for the past almost 20 years, serving as its Chief Operating Officer, Director of Hospice Services, team leader, and as a hospice nurse. And I'm proud to tell you that Kitty is also a Dominican alum. So this spring, Ms. Whitaker assumed the helm as the Hospice CEO. So it is my privilege to welcome Kitty Whitaker to the stage to introduce Dr. Gawande. Please welcome Kitty Whitaker.
We at Hospice by the Bay are delighted to participate in tonight's program and to welcome our special guest, renowned surgeon, award-winning writer, and public health researcher, Dr. Atul Gawande. Dr. Gawande practices general and endocrine surgery at Brigham and Women's Hospital in Boston. He is a professor in both the Department of Health Policy and Management at the Harvard School of Public Health and the Department of Surgery at Harvard Medical School. A MacArthur Fellow, Dr. Gawande has been a staff writer at The New Yorker since 1988. He has also written 3 New York Times bestsellers. Dr. Gawande is also executive director of Ariadne Labs, a joint center for health systems innovation, and chairman of Lifebox, a nonprofit organization making surgery safer globally. In his newest book, Being Mortal, Dr. Gawande tackles the hardest challenge of the medical profession: how medicine can not only improve life, but also the process of its ending. He demonstrates that a person's last weeks or months may be rich and dignified. Please join me in welcoming back to Dominican University, Dr. Atul Gawande.
Thank you for that welcome. Thank you for having me back to Dominican. I was here 4 years ago when I had my last book out, The Checklist Manifesto, and was just given the most warm welcome. I'm just delighted to be back here once more. This is a hard subject to try to talk about. I start off the book by noting something that now in retrospect seems a little bit surprising, but although I learned about a lot of things in medical school, mortality actually wasn't one of them. We understood our job as students, and I think our professors saw it the same way. We thought our job was to learn how the body might go wrong, and then learn how to fix that. You know, I went into surgery, and you conceive of that role, you know, the attraction is as much as anything else as the attraction is the chance to be a hero. You get to save the day. You get to feel very confident about those kinds of capabilities. But I found when I entered practice that I was often having to deal with problems that were not fixable, and that was a big part of my practice. Whether it was a chronic illness that just wasn't getting better, or problems of aging and frailty that weren't going to be fixed and go away, or certainly terminal illness, which all of us have to come to. And what I puzzled over was the fact that I could feel so competent in one realm of my work and so incompetent in being able to navigate these unfixables with people. What was my job? What was I supposed to do? I got a call not long ago from the husband of Peg Batchelder, who was my daughter's piano teacher. My daughter's Hunter, she was 13 years old at the time. She got lessons in the neighborhood, and so they were calling as, you know, friends and people who helped teach her. And they asked me one of these questions which you get either as a doctor or a family member or others, where they're asking you to help with one of these unfixable problems. And Martin, the husband, called saying, "Peg's in the hospital." And they shared with me that she had been someone who had had cancer several years before. She had a rare sarcoma, a soft tissue cancer in the pelvis that had involved the muscle and had advanced to the point that she required what's called a hemipelvectomy, removal of 1/3 of the pelvis and then replacing it with metal, chemotherapy, radiation. Then she had complications and infections and all kinds of trouble that kept her in the hospital for months. It was her year in hell, she said. She hadn't been able to teach. She had to give up ever bike riding, which was a major passion of hers. She was an avid yoga practitioner, and that had been set aside. But when she came through it, her prognosis was excellent. She had no evidence of disease. And she was able to return to teaching, which is what she loved the most. She was in her early 60s. She was tall and had lovely shoulder-length brown hair and this very graceful way of teaching. You know, many piano teachers are very sharp and authoritarian, and she had this way of simply being this positive, encouraging, pushing presence who could be your biggest enthusiast when you had cracked even the smallest problem as a student. And so my daughter Hunter, you know, happily returned to have her as her teacher. About 3 years after that cancer treatment, however, she developed a complication of the cancer treatment, a leukemia-like malignancy caused by the chemotherapy. And for that, she had to go back on another kind of chemotherapy. She insisted on keeping teaching all the way through it. And my daughter would, you know, occasionally be told, well, we're going to move your appointment for your lesson a couple of days here or there because Peg's getting her treatment. But then we were notified for a couple weeks running that her lessons were canceled. And that was when Martin called. He was calling from the hospital room where Peg was. He put Peg on speaker, and she spoke in this weak and halting voice, long pauses between sentences. And what she said was that the treatment for the leukemia-like malignancy was not working. Her blood counts were continuing to fall, which is what happens with leukemia. With the falling blood counts and the chemotherapy she was on, her immune system was suppressed, and so she began to develop fevers and then an infection. They did a CT scan to look and see where the infection sources might be, and discovered that her original cancer had come back in her pelvis and spread through her liver. And now she was calling because after all of that, the tumor advanced. It caused severe pain. The pain immobilized her. She got admitted to the hospital. She became incontinent. The pain was mounting and worse. And she wanted to know, what should she do? I said, well, what did your doctor say you should do? What did they say you could do? And she said they didn't have much. They were giving her blood transfusions to try to keep up her blood counts. They were giving her pain medications. They were giving her steroids for the tumor fevers. And they told her that there were no chemotherapies, no established chemotherapies that were effective in this situation. And this was one of those moments where I'd felt not so competent. What was I supposed to say to her? What was I supposed to do? And what strikes me is that this is also the moment we debate nationally. What is it that we think that she should do? Should we push her to, should I encourage her to look for a place that would offer an experimental therapy? Or encourage the doctors to, try whatever might be possible to try to fix the situation, because you can never be certain what might be possible. There might be a lottery ticket's chance that there is a solution to this. Or should she, as she put it, give up and go on hospice, which the doctors had suggested to her? In the course of writing this book and doing the investigations for it, it originally started as a New Yorker article back in 2007, and then I continued to mine and think about these kinds of topics. I ended up interviewing a couple hundred patients about their experiences with aging and serious illness, their families, scores of physicians of various kinds, geriatricians, oncologists, ICU doctors, palliative care specialists. I visited hospice nurses on their rounds. I visited nursing homes and met nursing home aides and reformers and contrarians and academics. And one of the things that I found was that a good answer to what we might be able to do or offer or think of as options in this situation was tied to a seemingly unrelated study that was done not far from here at Stanford by a professor named Laura Carstensen. And what she did was she had a landmark series of studies that involved tracking and studying the emotional lives of people as they age. She was puzzling over what is the experience of finding you're up against the limits of what biology lets us do. And she enrolled people from ages 18 to 94 in the study and gave them a beeper. And she followed them. She continues to follow them now more than 20 years later. Her team would page the people in the study, and at that moment they were to stop and fill out a little form that they were given that might, for example, ask them to record what their emotions were at that moment in time. What emotions were you experiencing? Were you happy? Were you sad? Were you frustrated? Angry? The They also did these trade-off studies. They would ask people to tell them, how would you like to spend a half hour of your time? Would you like to spend it with a family member? You know, they gave them a deck of cards and they would ask them to arrange it in order of the people you'd most like to be with if you had half an hour to spend with one person, or you'd least like to be with. And it would range from, you'd have family members, you'd have, acquaintances, you'd have people, the singer of a favorite song, a movie star you really admire. And a few things came out of this study. Number one was that as we age, our desires change. That there's a kind of young signature and there's an older signature. And the young signature is that people wanted to be achieving and getting stuff and getting public recognition. And the older signature was that, also in the younger signature, was that people wanted to have wide social networks and be connected to lots of people and meet people. Even introverts wanted to be connected more than what the older signature looked like. The older signature was people wanted narrower groups of people they were connected to, but deeper, more intimate relationships with those people. That the older signature included simply wanting to be more than wanting to get and to have public recognition. People wanted to reach out and make a difference, but it was often making a difference for those people closest to them. It was connection to a smaller group of people that was important. Emotions changed too, and there are many surprising findings. One, validated in other studies as well, was that as people got older, although they declined in their health, although they declined in their abilities, they became happier, more satisfied in life, less likely to have depression and major anxiety. Their emotions became more sophisticated. They were capable of experiencing certain kinds of emotions that the young people weren't even capable of. For example, poignancy, experiencing positive and negative emotions at the same time. Well, there's a lot of puzzling over why does it seem to take so long to have those kinds of desires, feelings, and emotions? Because this is what we describe as wisdom, right? Wisdom is realizing that, just getting stuff doesn't actually turn out to be as satisfying as simply being. That, hanging out at a nightclub, shouting at the top of your lungs in order to be heard, all in the hope that at 2 a.m. you might meet somebody sort of interesting. Doesn't turn out to be, a really mature idea of a good time. So why would it take so long to discover how satisfying it can be to be close to others and connected in these ways? And there was one line of theory is that, it just takes time and it takes experience. And you have to learn from practice and doing it. It's kind of a skill and it takes years to begin to get that kind of wisdom. Another view is that the brain is actually changing, that your brain has to develop these kinds of capabilities for certain kinds of emotions and that kind of perspective on life. The funny thing was that Laura Carstenson's work ultimately showed that those theories were wrong. And what she found was that, for example, during this set of studies, 9/11 happened. And suddenly, all of the young people moved to the older signature almost overnight. They suddenly didn't want to go to the nightclub anymore. They wanted to be with family and make sure they were all right and be connected to them. That when life became fragile and uncertain and its limitations came into view, we suddenly wanted a much tighter, narrower group of people, and we were concerned about intimacy and being close to them. Suddenly didn't care so much about that public recognition and that achieving mentality, and much more about making a difference for those you're close to. And what was interesting also that Laura Carstensen found that she could change how the elderly felt remarkably easily. She would say to them, for example, imagine that the doctor calls you and tells you that there is a new drug that can add 20 years to your life, will add 20 years to your life at the level of quality of life that you have now. And I've written the prescription and it's waiting at the pharmacy for you. Now, how would you like to spend half an hour of your time? And suddenly, I'd kind of like to see that movie star after all. And, I can hanging out with my sister, that can wait. And suddenly, that project that I was hoping to get off the ground and, try to aim for that ambitious idea I hadn't been thinking about, suddenly that becomes more appealing. People shifted from the older signature to the younger signature. And by the way, 3 months after 9/11, and you go back and you check on those people who all coalesced around wanting to be close to those who were closest to them, they suddenly went back to the old way of doing things. Yeah, that was fine. I'm going to go back to that nightclub again. The lessons were that there were a couple of lessons that came out of this. Number one was that perspective matters. And how much you perceive your life to be fragile, to be limited, to have uncertainties, really affects deeply what you value, what you even emotionally experience. She looked at HIV patients who were in their 20s and had advanced to end-stage AIDS, and found that the terminally ill population had the same kind of wisdom that the older people had. The second thing is that well-being is possible even under severe constraints. And I think we've lost sight of this. The dramatic change of the last century is that we've added 30 years to people's lives. On average, survival at the end of the 19th century was 47 years. By the end of the 20th century, it was 78 years. Much of that was from public health and from improved sanitation. But in the last half century, it's also been adding years of life at the end of life, where we have higher quality of life in many ways. And there's no better time to be old in many ways. There's a second part of it, though, which is that the trajectory of life changed along the way. Before this century, there was actually no clear relation between your age and your risk of dying. Whether you were 5 or 20 or 40 or 80, the 80-year-old simply had been lucky and made it through all of the risks that were around in society. But you could be 20 years old and drop dead of, Spanish influenza. George Washington died from a strep throat because we didn't have any ability to treat that. He died 3 days after a strep throat. Anything could come along and kill you, and you were aware that life was fragile. And as a result, we had an understanding that a good life was more complicated than just being healthy. That our priorities went beyond just survival and being alive. There's a book that I ended up reading that I found incredibly provocative and interesting by a 19th century philosopher named Josiah Royce. He was at Harvard. He wrote a book called The Philosophy of Loyalty, and that was published in 1908. And what he wanted to know, what he was exploring in this book, was why being simply alive and well-fed and comfortable felt so insufficient to people. And he believed that the reason was that people have an intrinsic human need to live for something beyond ourselves. He called that thing you live for, that might be larger than you, your loyalty. Your loyalty might be to family, your kids. It might be to your country. It might be to an ideal. It might be to God. But people are willing to sacrifice of themselves, sacrifice their health. They were supposedly sacrifice their well-being, but this was well-being to them. And he contrasted that with an individualist view. The individualist view is that, self-interest is really actually what drives people. You scratch under the surface and, you never went wrong being cynical about people's motivations in America, did you? You give them a little money and they'll do anything you want them to do. Well, he puzzled and went through a number of puzzles that helped reveal to me anyway, pretty convincingly, that that's not actually true. There are many situations in which we don't behave out of pure self-interest. He posed a puzzle, for example, of why do we care about what happens to the world after we die? If we're truly self-interested, if our own desires and achievements are the only thing that matter in our life, then why, if I told you that the world was going to blow up and take everybody with it an hour after you died, why do most people say that would make them sad? In fact, make them feel a great loss. You're not going to be alive. Why, if you're really, why should that be important? And the reason why is that it feels like if that happened, the meaning of having been alive would be wiped away, would be gone. The idea that you would sacrifice yourself, your life or your health for meaning and for those kinds of ideas really makes it complicated when you're a doctor, where we think that the priority is just health and survival. I think part of the reason we lose sight of this is today we get to live most of our lives without ever really having to think about life being fragile. You can get to age 65 with a huge level of likelihood that you really don't have to worry about your health. It might be something that comes out of the blue. It could be an unexpected illness. Could be a car crash that can bring it into view that you're in fact a mortal being. But even when you get to age 65, you have ahead of you 18 years if you're a male. You live today. If you're 65 today, your median survival is 83 years or longer. And if you're a female, it's 86. And what Laura Carstensen found was that basically, if you feel that you have 20 years or more ahead of you, we live as if we're immortal. We live without having to think or worry that our life is fragile or in the balance. And it's led us to a place where we spend most of our lives thinking that a good life is really the equivalent of being independent and healthy. And that doesn't fit with this idea that people who are older might actually be happier and more satisfied in certain ways. It doesn't fit with the reality that we age, we become frail, we become sick. The medical focus is on survival and health because of this idea that, of course, the priority is health. But in fact, well-being for people is bigger than health and safety, and people like Royce help me understand that. And that very narrow viewpoint of medicine of being focused on survival leads us to feel pretty lost when it's not possible. Leads us to feel kind of lost about, what am I supposed to do as a surgeon if I have to deal with frailty or a chronic illness that's not going away or a terminal illness. And therefore, I think what we get is suffering. When we created nursing homes, we created old age homes, they were created with the hospital ideals really in mind. And those ideals are, again, of health and safety. And when you go into places, they will tell you, we're incredibly safe. But then you see what the trade-offs are that those require, and you start to get a sense of why people are so miserable in nursing homes. You know, as you get older, people are happier over time, until they have to be in an institution, until they become institutionalized. And then, as one person that I wrote about put it, then you become the victim of the three plagues: loneliness, boredom, and helplessness. In a nursing home, you will be safe, you will have assurance that your kind of physical needs are met, but not much thinking about, you know, what are your loyalties and mission, and how do we help support that? We don't think about what gives you joys. For example, you can't have alcohol in a nursing home. You might have medically ordered diet that says you can only have pureed food. I met people and read reports where people were being written up for violating their food rules. You're living in a place where you get written up in the first place. And then you meet an 85-year-old Alzheimer's patient who's hoarding cookies. Like, let him have the damn cookies. Yes, it's a possibility that they could choke on a cookie. But if your life has become one where food is one of your great pleasures, why would we take that away? And that's where we begin to understand that we haven't had an imagination for this larger idea of what we're aiming for. And you see it in the hospital, and I saw it with Peg Batchelder. We'd lost our imagination that Peg, lying in bed, in pain, with a metastatic cancer that there wasn't any known treatment for, might actually still have a life worth living. And that we might be able to help her with that. We have an assisted death debate that's, and I think that many people in her position might choose the option of assisted death. And I have a complicated set of feelings about this. I do believe that people who face unbearable suffering deserve options that might even hasten their death in order to be relieved of that suffering if we cannot do anything about it, if it's unavoidable, unbearable suffering. But I'm troubled by the idea that the goal that we might have is a good death. The goal is as good a life as possible all the way to the very end. And it can be harder to assist people with living when they face their constraints than necessarily achieving an assisted death. And what I began to see was that we often miss out on the possibilities because we haven't imagined that there might be any. As I conducted that investigation of talking to lots of folks and seeing what people did, and I began to understand what some experts have who are in palliative care and hospice and other fields, I think what they are showing us is something that medicine and society have missed, which is that people have priorities besides living longer. That can be those loyalties, it can be wanting to be cognitively intact, it may be that they, simply just want to be at home rather than in an institution, that they, just want to be with their dog. But whatever they are, people have priorities besides just living longer. And the second thing that many of these people are showing us is that people, the most reliable way to learn what people's priorities are is to ask them. And we don't ask them. It takes some skill to know how to ask them. I didn't know what words I should use. What should I ask? As I was talking to folks, I asked them, what's my checklist that I should follow when I'm with my patient the next time? What is it that I should be doing? How do I ask this? And they said that, there's a few basic things. Number one, you shouldn't talk so much. The ideal conversation is one where you're talking less than 50% of the time as a doctor. And as I paid attention to my clinic, I was embarrassed to see I spoke 90% of the time. Lots of facts and pros and cons and risks and benefits, and now what do you want to do? And once you realize you need to talk less, your most effective way of doing that is going to be to ask questions. And there were certain questions they thought were, that I noticed that people who were really effective tended to ask. One of those questions, for example, is, what is your understanding of your health and your condition? Or what are your fears and worries for the future? What are your goals if your health worsens? What are the outcomes that are unacceptable to you? So, on the phone with Peg, I decided to ask those questions. Not everyone can answer them. But I asked her, I said, so now, what's your understanding of your health condition? And she said, flat out, I'm going to die. There's nothing more that they can do. And there was anger in her voice about it. I said, do you have some goals? What would be your goals if your health is worsening? She said that she didn't have any that she could see possible. So then I said, well, what are your fears and worries for the future? And she gave me a litany. She feared facing more pain. She feared the humiliation of losing even more of her bodily control. She feared dying in the hospital. She said, I've been here for days, just getting worse, and is this all there is? When I went visiting with hospice nurses and doctors to understand what they did, it's interesting. I had not really understood what hospice was. I thought it was a black hooded nurse with an IV drip of morphine. Going to keep you comfortable. But when I visited and followed around with them, they said, just keeping you comfortable is not, at least with the way one nurse put it, it wasn't her goal. She wasn't trying to let nature just take its course. It wasn't about what you stop. It was a difference in what you fight for. Medicine sacrifices your time and your quality of life now for the sake of time later. And she said what she was trying to do was the opposite. She wanted to use whatever capabilities that she could have, she could find, to fight to give people their best possible day, regardless of what that meant about how much time you might have. And it was a sort of fascinating Zen idea, because hospice, you think it shortens people's lives, but there's studies again and again that hospice or palliative care, hospice is limited to your last 6 months of life. Palliative care is about whenever you might be facing serious illness, trying to make sure that we're working towards giving you a good day. And those studies show that people not only don't live shorter, in many cases they live longer. Well, in the case of Peg Batchelder, I said that, it seems like it's been a while since you had a good day. Might trying to make the best day possible be something that would seem worthwhile. Seemed like something worth hoping for, just one good day. And she said, well, yes, maybe that could be worth trying to fight for. And so 2 days later, Martin, her husband, persuaded her to go ahead and enroll in hospice, and she was taken home. I had to break the news to Hunter, my 13-year-old. She was not going to have piano lessons with Peg anymore. And I had to explain to her that she was dying. She was struck low. She said she wanted to go see her. And I said that likely could not happen. And then we got a surprising call, and it was from Peg. She wanted to know if we might be willing, and if Hunter was willing, could she resume teaching Hunter again on hospice? And that was more than she or I ever imagined possible. But her hospice nurse, her name was Deborah, came and talked to Peg about what she cared about most in her life, and then she worked to try to make it happen. Her first goal ended up being just managing the pain and the daily difficulties of all that she was up against. And so they arranged for a hospital bed to be put in the first floor of their home so she wouldn't have to navigate the stairs, which were impossible for her. They put a portable commode next to the bed. They worked out a plan for being able to bathe and get dressed. They experimented it with, a doctor was involved, different kinds of pain medication, and eventually they found that a combination of morphine and a drug called gabapentin got her pain under control, and that if they gave her Ritalin, this combated the stupor that the medications could produce. And with that, her anxieties plunged as all of these challenges came under control. And suddenly she began to lift her sights. Martin later said, she became focused on the main chance. She came to a clear view of how she wanted to live the rest of her days. She was going to be home, and she was going to teach. Now, it took planning and a lot of medical expertise to be able to make each lesson possible. They needed to calibrate the medications so that she got enough morphine to teach, but not so much as to be groggy and slurring her speech and freaking the kids out. And they found that place. Martin said that she became more alive running up to a lesson and for the days after than he'd seen her in a long time. She didn't have any children. Her students filled that place for her, and she still had some things she wanted them to know before she went. She wanted to say her goodbyes, give her parting advice. I think medicine has forgotten how vital such matters are to people as they approach life's end. People want to share memories, pass on wisdoms and keepsakes, connect with loved ones, make some last contributions to the world. Many people argue that that role is among life's most important. It's an essential part of how our lives achieve meaning. And the way we in medicine can deny people these moments out of obtuseness and neglect is, I think, cause for our shame. Peg got to fulfill her final role, however. She lived 6 full weeks after that. Hunter got lessons for 4 of them, and there were 2 concerts that were held. One was a children's recital with the children that she was teaching in those final days, and then a concert featuring the former students she'd had who are now all over the country who came back together to play for her. The concerts were in her living room, and her students played Brahms and Dvorak and Chopin and Beethoven for their adored teacher. A week after, Peg fell into delirium, and then a few days after that, she died peacefully in her bed. My final remembrance of her, however, was from near the end of the children's recital a few weeks before. She'd stood off to the side after the music had been played and brought each child up individually to see her, gave them each a gift and a few words, and I got to see Hunter go up when it was her turn. Peg gave her a book of music that she'd picked out and wanted her to keep and to learn. And then she put her arm around her shoulder and gave her one more gift. "You're special," she whispered to her. And that was something she never wanted the kids to forget. Thank you.
Fabulous. I'm going to ask the questions, and if there are more questions, please let me know, okay? One of the questions that I have several cards for is, how do you do this? You're practicing medicine, you're a working surgeon, you've written these books that require so much research. How is this possible?
I don't watch that much TV.
I'm going to stand over here so they can see you.
You know, one thing that I've talked about with also young people who sometimes think about even going into surgery is if you want to make a difference, you give up on balance. So I don't really go for balance. My family pays the price. I'm here today, not home with them. And you know, I often steal time from them to write. I write a lot on the weekends and a lot of our vacations. And my 20th anniversary with my wife was finishing this book. And we went to Italy, which was fabulous. And I stayed in the hotel and wrote all day, and she went to the museums. And then we'd have a nice dinner at night. And, you know, it's not quite fair to her, but I like it.
She might like it too. It's fun to go to the museum without anyone else saying, let's
Yeah, well,
move on.
having me be crabby about the museums was not necessarily her good idea of a good time anyway.
We have a number of questions about the checklist, which I think has changed so much in many fields beyond medicine. But one person asks if you know if our country is using a checklist in dealing with Ebola.
Well, so this is a very interesting, so the last book that I wrote was about the idea that, you know, we relied for a long time on the idea that individual judgment would be the best way to harness the information of the world about the way that things should be done in whatever field it was, that it was the individual judgment and autonomy of the pilot or of the surgeon or of the team in the emergency room was going to be the single most effective way to capture the best way of doing things. And what we found is that we've generated so much knowledge over the last century that it's overwhelmed the ability of individuals to keep up with it, to know what to do when, how, to remember it, to have it organized, and to be really effective. And the people in aviation really showed it to us first. How much more safe they could make flying planes in 1930s, and turn planes that had become incredibly more complex and were crashing all the time. You know, naval aviators had a 1 in 4 chance of dying on the job, and moving to a world where they had a before takeoff checklist suddenly began to eliminate those kinds of problems and really systematic ways that they created for communication. And we deployed that capability in surgery, and in 2007 we published some of those results, and I wrote it up in the book. And what we found was we could lower the death rates 47%. It was bigger than any drug, bigger than any device. It's been replicated now in the VA system. They lowered the death rates 18% across the VA system. The Netherlands lowered their death rates close to 50%. Scotland has been able to save more than 9,000 lives in the last couple of years and become the first country that I've seen to really get the death rate below 0.5% in surgery using these kind of systematic approaches. Well, Ebola ended up showing us some of the vulnerabilities in our own system as well. In my second book, Better, I wrote about the problem of hand washing and putting on gloves and gowns. These very basic infection control practices, and we pick up, you know, you can get an infection in a hospital to the tune of 2 million people a year who get infections in hospitals that they didn't have going in. 75,000 people a year die from hospital infections that are passed along by workers who simply have not followed basic hygiene and public health control measures that we know are effective. And the fascinating thing about Ebola is, let me just say, we are not going to have an outbreak of Ebola that's going to spread and run rampant through our society, like the flu. It's much harder to pass, even though it has frighteningly passed along to the nurses who took care of Thomas Duncan. What we know about it is that it does not pass in the air. It passes from the bodily secretions, and when people get sick with Ebola, they produce a lot of those bodily secretions. They have, and I'll be explicit here, they have vomiting, they have diarrhea, they get really sick. It's very visible. And the people who are the caregivers are the ones who are most vulnerable. the families who are caregiving at home, and then the healthcare workers. And that's how the virus ends up spreading. Well, the measures to provide isolation and control have been known for a while, and our team did get called in to help with the CDC's design of their checklists that hospitals were to adopt, and we helped them about 3 weeks ago as it began to become apparent that we had to be prepared for this to come to possibly come to hospitals in and around. And the team in Dallas was one that had the checklists available, and yet don't necessarily get followed. That it hasn't become part of our learning. That we're still a place that hasn't learned how to put on gowns and gloves properly and take them off properly. And so now we've made the measures incredibly more complex, hazmat suits and respirators and cover every inch of skin, but the previous epidemics and this virus isn't different, have been controlled over 40 years, mainly just by following the basic measures and knowing how to use them. So where we are is, I think, that we may well find another case crop up somewhere. I think suddenly our hospitals are discovering those basic hygiene protocols. It took this case to force us to come face to face with it and to recognize we needed to clean up our act, and literally, and that's starting to happen here at home. The big worry I have is that you have to stop the virus at its source. Doctors Without Borders, this outbreak started in December last year. Doctors Without Borders was the first group to treat it, and in March of this year, they sent out an alert saying this is the worst outbreak they've ever seen. It was doubling the number of people infected every 3 weeks. We need help. The hospital beds are overwhelmed. And the world's response was, nah. And they asked for help in May, they asked for help in June, they asked for help in July. It reached hundreds of people infected, and still nothing. Second week of September, they're asking for help, and still got nothing. And so in a way, it's a kind of good thing that the first infection to leave Africa came to the US. Because now we're actually doing something. We're mobilizing thousands of people to go into the field and, like soldiers, take some risk in their lives in order to contain this epidemic. And it can be done district by district with basic building of containment facilities and having gloves and gowns and being able to isolate people and care for them. We're still not acting with enough numbers, and we've responded with about 3,000 personnel. We need more than that. That's a small drop in the bucket. And Europe has responded with very little. We will have to mobilize far more to have this contained. So sorry to go on at length, but Ebola is really important and important for people to know about.
For answering our questions, for your books, and for really making a difference in our lives. So we so appreciate it. Thank you, Dr. Gawande.
Thank you all.